Good evening, everyone. Welcome to World Now. I'm Jim Falk. And as always, I'm very grateful to the World Affairs Council of Connecticut for hosting tonight's discussion and to the growing number of councils across the country who offer World Now as a benefit to all of their members. Special shout out to the president of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, Megan Torrey, and Abby Noyes, who produces this podcast. Now, I think many councils are doing what the Council on Foreign Relations is doing, and that's celebrating the 250th anniversary of our country. And the Council, the Council on Foreign Relations, recently released a fascinating and truly carefully curated report ranking the best foreign policy decisions, and as you know, also the worst, over the last, I shouldn't say the last 250 years because it goes up to 2020. And this project was led by my good friend and a friend of many councils, Jim Lindsay, and he is the Mary and David Boys Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. And he also hosts really one of my favorite podcasts, and that's The President's Inbox. You really must put that on your must-listen to queue for a podcast. Now, Jim has said, and Jim, it's good to see you. Thanks for
Good to
being
see you,
here.
Jim.
Jim has said that lists are an invitation for a conversation. And over the next hour, really going to encourage you, our audience, to do something a little bit different than what I usually say, because I usually say, don't write too much in the chat, because I'm not going to be able to read it. Put your questions still in the Q&A box. But tonight's discussion really does lend itself to a lot of give and take. So please feel free to write those comments in the chat and people will be able to read it, and maybe Jim and I will highlight some of them as well. But for your questions, do put them in the Q&A box. And so let's get started, because I think we're for sure going to have a very lively conversation. Jim, how did this whole concept come about? It seems like something that you might have been working on, and perhaps it initiated a long time ago, but is this really the first time that such a study had been conducted?
Oh, this is the first study that I'm aware of that tried to rank the best and worst in U.S. foreign policy, Jim. And I'd love to claim the credit for coming up with the idea to do it, but it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to David Rubenstein. David is the chairman of the board here at the council. As many people may know, David is championing what he calls patriotic philanthropy. He's done a lot to raise awareness about American history. He's helped financed the restoration of the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial. He's put a copy of the Magna Carta on permanent loan at the National Archives. And one day, David asked a very simple question: what would you consider to be the best decisions in U.S. foreign policy history, and what would be the worst? And my answer was, well, it depends upon who you ask. And that started us on the journey we have here right now.
And so you sent a survey, and we'll come more about how you built a survey,
Mhm.
but to an organization that I hate to admit I really wasn't familiar with. Tell us about this group.
The group is SHAFR. It's the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. It is the foremost professional association of historians who work on American foreign policy. And since we were looking to get a ranking of foreign policy decisions since the inception of the country, wanted to go to people who spend a lot of time not just thinking about or writing about American foreign policy, but a lot of time teaching it. One of the things you learn when you're a teacher, particularly when you do a survey course, is that you have to know an awful lot of material. So we naturally thought of the folks at SHAFR.
In a little bit, we'll get to the 10 best and 10 worst, but when I read more about how you conducted the study, you had 500 decisions. Who identified those 500 decisions that you eventually winnowed down
Yeah.
to the 20 plus?
That's a great question, Jim. And I would say we actually started out with about 700 decisions, and we got those 700 decisions because I and a research associate got a dozen of the biggest uh, sort of standard surveys of American foreign policy history. We read them from cover to cover. We jotted down what looked to be decisions. That got us about 700. And we formed an advisory committee composed of senior members of SHAFR to help us whittle it down. I made the command decision that if I gave my advisory committee, composed of these people who are very busy with their day jobs, the task of going through 700 decisions, that they would mutiny on me, especially since I wasn't paying for their time. So we whittled it down basically about 200 and then said to the members of the advisory committee, which of these would you get rid of? Which things do you think we missed and were, in being too zealous to prune our list? And eventually we got it down to 120.
And the members that participated in the survey, how many were offered the opportunity to do so, and how many participated?
Well, it went to the entire membership of SHAFR, which is slightly more than 1,000 people. We wanted to make sure that the survey didn't, how shall I call it, escape into the wild, where people who weren't SHAFR members would get a chance to do it. So we went through a process. People had to verify their membership in SHAFR for us to accept the survey. We got about 500 responses overall, and we had 360 that we could definitely verify is coming from SHAFR members. And the results that are reported in the survey are from those roughly 360 responses.
Now, I took statistics a very long time ago, probably almost a half century ago. Talk about how you tabulated it and weighted the results, because it was a bit more complicated. I had to read that twice.
Well, I wish I could say something that was going to make the professors who taught me econometrics at Yale when I earned my PhD proud, but I don't think this is going to do it. Essentially, the method we use to come up with the ranking is equivalent to what has been used for a very long time in ranking college football teams and college basketball teams. So in essence, in this case, what we did was we told people, pick from this list, pick 10 decisions that would basically top the charts for you, and then rank them for us. And we asked them to do that for the decisions on the best list and on the worst list. And I should note, it was the same set of decisions for both questions. And then we asked people to rank it. And then we basically took whatever somebody ranked it, and then we did we call a weighted total. So if you made something number one, that got 10 points. If it was ranked number 10, it got 1 point. We totaled it all up, and that's the results that we got.
How did people see the decisions? Were they alphabetical, chronological?
The decisions were all chronological, and the respondents had an opportunity to go through and look at the decisions, the list of decisions before they filled it out. There was no time limit on completing the survey, so people could take their time. And some people, my sense is from post-survey conversations, did it fairly quickly. Some people agonized over their choices. So you get a sort of a mix of motivations of the people doing it. And again, we also asked people to give us some sense of why they picked their top three in each list. So we had a little bit of a feel, not just for what the ranking was, but why people wanted to pick that decision. Now, I would have loved to have been in a situation, Jim, where I could have persuaded people to explain each of the 10 decisions and why number 3 was ahead of number 5. But the practicalities of asking people to do this and sort of impinging upon their time made that impractical.
But that's not been made public, right? Or has it?
No, that has not been made public, though I should say, I mean, when we did the survey for me is really a means to an end. And the end was to build a website that looked at the best and worst decisions in U.S. foreign policy history. And so the feedback we got from people, why they picked their top 3, helped us to build the website so we could not just tell people what happened, but also to explain why it is that historians thought this decision merited being on one of the lists.
And I think I understand, obviously, why you ended in 2020, but was there debate and discussion about extending it at least into President Biden's first term? And you didn't release the study until just a few months ago.
Yeah, we conducted the study in October, November of 2023, and we cut off the last decision coming in the first Trump administration, 2020. And, Part of the reason for that is, and this is a big debate among historians, is how far back you have to go before you can really stop talking about the news and begin talking about history. So again, there was some conversation about actually having the cutoff period even earlier in American history, because if you always, with any survey like this, you always have the problem of recency bias. What's sort of happening right now in the news may stick with people. At the end, we decided because we were trying to cover a big expanse, there was no clear reason why we wouldn't end it in 2020 as opposed to 2016 or 2012.
Well, before we jump into really the list and the discussion of that, let me encourage people and remind you that we look forward to getting your questions, and I know Jim will give you great answers. In hindsight, is there anything you would have done differently in developing the study and how you did this?
Not really. I mean, in terms of how the study was conducted and rolled out, I was very happy with it. What I will say, Jim, is again, the big reason for doing this was to build this website, which people can find at CFR.org. And one of the things I discovered, it's very easy to promise somebody that you're going to build a website that will have primary documents and visuals and audio material and the rest. It is another thing to actually build a website. So that's one of the reasons, the main reason why there was a long time elapsed between when we conducted the survey, when we launched it back in January. Building a website takes a bit of effort, and I have newfound appreciation for people who do this for a living.
Well, as you can imagine, there are lots of leaders of World Affairs Councils and other organizations and authors on this podcast tonight, and I think we all empathize with that. Plus, it can be very expensive. You know, when I first looked at the list, I was struck by the fact that you were looking at Native Americans, and it made me realize just how we give such still short thrift to the history of our country and the role of Native Americans. Expand on that a bit, if you would.
That's an excellent question, Jim. And the reason we included U.S. relations with indigenous peoples up through 1871 is because that is how U.S. law treated Native peoples over the first portion of American history. That is, they were treated as sovereign nations. And indeed, the United States signed numerous treaties with Indian nations. And if you go over to the Dwight D. Eisenhower Executive Office Building, which is a block from where I am right now, you can go to something called the Indian Treaty Room. It's quite ornate, quite beautiful, where a number of those treaties had been signed. And so the decision was made, and certainly was, I think, with the great encouragement of my advisory committee, that we should include decisions made toward Native American peoples in the survey, since the people at the time considered themselves as dealing with foreigners in sovereign nations.
Before we do the unveil, the great unveil, remind us what the criteria was to determine if a decision was good or bad.
We actually kept the question very simple, Jim. We simply asked people to tell us, looking at this list, which 10 decisions do you think did the most to advance U.S. interests and values? We went no deeper than that, in part because as we sort of deliberated this as an advisory committee, and we tried to think about different wordings and trying to explain, we found that there was no easy way to sort of get at what we wanted. And different word choices like most significant, most costly, all had people might read in very different ways. So we decided at the end of the day that there is a great blessing and a great advantage just keeping things simple and let people make that decision themselves. And again, since we had space for people to tell us a little bit about their responses, we have a sense of the criteria people were thinking about as they made their judgments. And I also have to admit, I've spent some time with SHAFR historians since doing the survey and had a lot of deep dives with people about the choices and selections they made and what drove them.
Well, I said we were about to do the unveil, but before, we just got this question in from Tarek Rajev, who's in Dallas. And he says, how did you deal with the age specificity of the participants doing the rankings? Did you know the people's age, and could you do a deep dive and see the gender of the participants and their age?
Yeah, we have all the demographic criteria of the people who filled out the survey. And if I had one takeaway from looking at the criteria, the demographic stuff, which wasn't just race or age, but the kind of school people taught at, what their specialties were. My main takeaway is that the real big sort of correlation is that people tend to like decisions that came in the time period that they themselves study.
Hmm.
So if you look at people who are historians of the early American Republic, they're probably more inclined to note things like the Jay Treaty or the Treaty of Alliance with France, whereas people who, let's say, focus on mid 20th century foreign policy tend to go for things like the Lend-Lease Act and the Marshall Plan.
That makes sense. Abby, let's put the graphic up and keep it up while we're talking about this for a little bit. Um, so, Jim, let me just ask you to walk through this and how we see it, and some of the themes that come out from looking at the best. And when you look at the worst, you see some themes as well,
Yep.
which we'll look at in a few minutes.
Well, I won't read through the list, Jim. I will just say one immediate takeaway for everybody is that the Marshall Plan was number one by a country mile. It was selected by 90% of the people who filled out the survey, and its weighted total was about 40% higher than what came in number two, the creation of the United Nations. And again, if you go to CFR.org and you visit the website, we have the complete survey results all the way down to decision 120. And I would say, looking at the best list, what really sort of jumps out is that historians ranked very highly decisions that displayed what we might call enlightened self-interest, instances in which the United States made decisions that served America's interests, but also benefited others. I mean, the Marshall Plan is a leading example of this. Say the same thing about the United Nations, the Lend-Lease Act, and Bretton Woods, which comes in at number 7. I think something else about the issues on the top 10 list and for on the best side would be those decisions that secure American sovereignty and security. And here you clearly have the Treaty of Alliance with France, without which it's not at all clear that the American Revolution would have succeeded. But again, you had the Louisiana Purchase, which we tend to think of as a great land deal, more than double the size of the United States. But what was really important to doing is removing the threat of European imperialism on America's western borders. And likewise, you have the Monroe Doctrine. And what's not on here, number 19, the Proclamation of Neutrality, where President Washington said, a war is broken out in Europe. I have partisans here who want to side with Britain, partisans here who want to side with France because of the Treaty of Alliance with France, but we are going to sit it out. I think that was a consequential decision that really reflected a desire to secure American sovereignty.
We looked at the top 10. What are some of the decisions that were in the top 20, or some, rephrase that slightly, that perhaps you thought should have been in the list that weren't?
Another great question. I mean, I will simply say here, one of the reasons I like lists is because lists are invitations to debate and to argue. And I think one of the ways people learn is by hopefully having a civil argument or discussion about this. I mean, I think if you were to look down, if you get numbers, let's say 10 through 25 or 11 through 25, you see a number of decisions related to arms control that do very highly. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, the SALT treaties, the ABM Treaty. Likewise, you could throw in the Berlin Airlift. I think something else that sort of shows up around, I think it's number 14, is the opening to China, when Richard Nixon went to Beijing and met with Mao. I think that shows up there. Also, I think, for George H.W. Bush, his handling of the end of the Cold War and his handling of the unification or reunification of Germany show up high in the list. They are at 17 and 18. And actually, looking at sort of where George H.W. Bush's successes are listed reminds me of the fact that one of the challenges is that if a president acts in a way that is very successful, there is a tendency to forget that there was ever a big deal in any event. And I think if you were to sort of transport yourself back to 1989, 1990, 1991, there was a lot of concern about the collapse of the Soviet Union, what it would mean for American foreign policy, that it could go badly. Likewise, I mean, if you think of the reunification of Germany, it was fiercely opposed by Francois Mitterrand of France and by Margaret Thatcher of Britain. In fact, Prime Minister Thatcher liked to say she loved Germany so much she wanted two of them. Nonetheless, I don't think anyone today wakes up and thinks about German reunification. So in that sense, the ultimate success is people may think it's no big deal at all.
And that makes me think about Michael McFaul in his book, Autocrats versus Democrats, where he talks about non-events, which if a non-event is done well, then that shows the strength of the diplomats who address the situation.
Yeah. You're quite right. And one of the things we toyed with was how do you measure what we might call non-decisions? That is, instances in which presidents or Congresses debated doing something and then didn't. So perhaps famously, President Dwight Eisenhower in 1954 contemplated the United States intervening to relieve the French forces at Dien Bien Phu, and then ultimately decided that isn't what he wanted to do. But of course, as you know, Jim, the problem with non-decisions is how do you actually determine what the non-decisions are? Because historians don't write about them because they weren't decisions. They weren't what actually happened. So I would always sort of have to acknowledge the reality that foreign policy is not only about what you do, call it your acts of commission, it's what you don't do, your acts of omission. And they can work well for you, they can work badly for you.
Cuban Missile Crisis is a good example.
Very good. But the Cuban Missile Crisis, we actually know what it is that President John F. Kennedy did. He had a choice.
In hindsight. Could have used,
yeah. Well, but in prospect, and when they formed the executive committee, the initial response was, we're going to quarantine or blockade Cuba, and we're going to hold an airstrike in our back pocket. But JFK didn't sort of go with sort of the first policy options, engaged in a bit of diplomacy, and some of which he didn't even reveal to members of his cabinet because they were a little bit of behind the scenes horse trading with Khrushchev, in which the Russians had to admit publicly to taking missiles out of Cuba, and we weren't required, or the Kennedy administration wasn't required to do the favor in terms of announcing that it was taking U.S. missiles out of Turkey. One of the sort of remarkable things is that Khrushchev agreed to that deal, which looked to most of the world for a very long time as an American unquestioned victory.
Remind me, when did that become public?
The
Turkey, that we removed our assets from Turkey.
That became talked about within years of the decision. It really wouldn't be until much later that it became public. And of course, when you look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, Jim, what's really interesting is for people in my business, people who study political science, international relations, the Cuban Missile Crisis was always held up as the decision that was sort of the epitome of smart presidential decision making, because Kennedy had a committee, had it formed, had it discuss the issues. He did not appear in most of its meetings because he didn't want people to try to guess his views so they could work things out and have an honest conversation. And so it's really held up as like a roadmap of how to handle the crisis. It actually turns out in retrospect that in some ways, Kennedy lucked out, In the early 1990s, there was a conference held in Cuba where a number of members of the JFK administration attended, most notably Robert McNamara. And McNamara learned some 30 years after the events that unbeknownst to him, unbeknownst to Kennedy, the Russians had active tactical nuclear warheads in Cuba. And if the United States had gone forward with any kind of airstrike or ground strike, it would have led to, in all likelihood, the use of nuclear weapons. Because remember, the United States has a base at Guantanamo.
Before we unveil the worst, is there anything that you would like to add about the best? Not that we won't come back to it, but I don't want to shift gears.
No, I think we probably should, Jim, show the worst list. I would just say, Jim, looking at this and on the worst list, it's really sort of three themes sort of come out. One is misguided military interventions. Here you have, the invasion of Iraq, the deployment of combat forces to Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. If you were to go further down the list, you have the overthrow of the president of Guatemala back in 1954, the annexation of the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, the overthrow of Salvador Allende. I think the other thing we see in sort of the worst decisions at the top are decisions that are contrary to American values, where the United States does something where it seems to be a big gap between what we claim as our foreign policy values and what we do. And here you have number three, the Indian Removal Act, the Trail of Tears, which is the forced removal of the Cherokee Nation. We have, if you were to go deeper in the list, number 12 is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which barred Chinese from legally emigrating into the United States, enhanced interrogation of detainees during the global war of terror. That was number 17, the Immigration Act of 1924. What I will also say about this list, Jim, as you look at it, as was the case with the Marshall Plan at the top of the best list, there was a real consensus that the invasion of Iraq belonged at the top of the worst list. It was on 88% of the ballots or surveys that were completed, and the overall point total, the weighted point total, was nearly twice that of the deployment of combat forces to Vietnam. And yes, even if you took number two, the deployment of combat forces to Vietnam, and added that total to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, you still wouldn't get as high a number as you got for the invasion of Iraq.
I see the bombing of Nagasaki is 10. What about the first bomb over Hiroshima? Where was
That
that
comes
ranked?
that comes in at number 15. And one of the questions I continually get is why is Hiroshima behind Nagasaki, or Nagasaki ahead of Hiroshima, given that the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima first? I think for many historians, certainly historians who completed the survey, what stands out about the bombing of Nagasaki is the sense that while you can argue about the wisdom or the necessity of dropping the bomb on Hiroshima, it is harder to make that argument about dropping the bomb on Nagasaki, really for two reasons. One is that the bombing of Nagasaki came just a few days after Hiroshima, not really giving the government in Tokyo any real time to assess what had actually happened at Hiroshima. It just came too quickly. The other thing was that originally the bombing of Nagasaki was scheduled for August the 11th, 2 days later. It was moved up 2 days because forecasts showed the weather was going to be bad. They wouldn't know if you had bad weather what you'd be dropping a bomb on. And so the decision to proceed with the bombing was moved up by 2 days, which then again further sort of again collapsed the timeline that the Japanese government had to consider its responses to what had happened.
Jim, you talk about the importance of American values, and I'll mention this in a few minutes, but I've just finished and interviewed Garrett Graff about his recent book about the dropping of the atomic bomb in the Manhattan Project. And do do you feel that what you see as the worst or the best really reflects human rights and humanitarian issues? Because I'll ask you this: where does the firebombing of and killing 100,000 people over Tokyo and the 66 cities that were bombed prior
Yeah.
to the dropping of the atomic bomb?
Yeah. Well, I have to say right here that as we did this survey, one of the things that we decided to do was not to include military operations during wartime, with the exception of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because they were qualitatively different with the nature of the weapon that was used. So there's no, people weren't given the option of what do you think about Pickett's charge during Gettysburg or the opening U.S. invasion of North Africa during World War II. So that's really just sort of a reflection. I suspect that if we had put that on, it would also have scored very highly. You could say the same thing about the bombing of Dresden in the strategic bombing campaign over the course of World War II. But again, in terms of how we did this, we settled, and I think reasonable people can disagree whether we settled in the right place, that Nagasaki and Hiroshima simply were different than everything else.
Well, let me bring in a few questions from our audience, and I think we'll have time for some more. So please send them if you have a good question to ask. And Nassim Kader in California says, to what extent do you think the best and the worst decisions were shaped by not just by material interests, but by the narratives of policymakers believed about America's role in the world?
I don't know how much they are shaped by what policymakers said at the time. Because again, these are historians looking at events long after they took place in most cases. So I'm not sure it's really driven by what policymakers said about those things. I think they're driven by how people retrospectively assess what it is that was done and how it fits into the broader arc of U.S. foreign policy. I do think it's quite clear, though, Jim, looking at it, that the historians in SHAFR are really attuned to what it is the United States has said about its foreign policy in cases in which it hasn't lived up to it. That's why you see things like support for the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh, the Iranian prime minister, showing up, I think, so highly because it was sort of seen as a proof of concept for the idea that the United States could go around, make and remake governments.
Ray Termini asked about the internment of Japanese in World War II not being on the
Yeah,
list. So, I mean,
yeah,
I
that was
guess,
not a,
is that a foreign or a domestic issue?
we treated that as a domestic issue. We had a long argument back and forth, and given that it's governed by domestic laws, we opted to do it that way.
As I mentioned, I had the chance to read and interview Garrett Graff last week about his book, The Devil Reached Toward the Sky. And Garrett has written 3 oral histories. And he talked about the importance of memory versus the ability to look back as historians. And I wonder if you'd given some thought to that and how this list might have been different. I mean, hypothetically, if people had done it closer to the event. I mean, now the Iraq
Yep.
invasion is in all of our memories, and
Yep.
some of these events are not.
Another great question, Jim. I would say that one of the things we learn from studying history is that historians' interpretation of what happened can change along with contemporaneous events. And so it's not necessarily something being recent versus long ago. Many times our own telling of our history is affected by, influenced by what is happening in the here and now. And the easiest way to see that is to pick up a textbook on the history of American foreign policy. One written in the 1880s sounds different than one written in the 1920s, which sounds different than one written in the 70s or one written today. what I find sort of most striking is, and you go back to, I mean, Gareth's books is excellent and he's really good at doing oral history, is you really want to sort of combine two, both sort of backward looking assessments with a sense of how people saw their challenges at the time. One of the mistakes you hope you won't make as a historian is to simply take whatever the expectations or norms are of your society and then just apply it on the past. There's an old joke about the past is a foreign place. They do things differently there. I mean, part of what you really want to do in telling a story is help people understand what people thought they were doing, what they thought their choice set was, and have some, not necessarily approval, but at least some empathy for how the world looked to them. At the same time, you don't want to just go back and say, this is how people saw the world, and so this is what happened, because as we all know, in the moment, you may have very strong feelings about something, Jim, but you lack perspective. One of the things that retreating from an event in your personal life or national life is you can get a better sense of maybe there was just a passion that ran through the crowd. Maybe people didn't necessarily assess what the consequences were. That can really sort of change how you think about the war. And here I actually would just point out, to me, one of the most remarkable times in American history, which is really the 20 years from World War I to just before World War II. The United States went off to World War I to make the world safe for democracy. There was a burst of national enthusiasm for it. By the early 1930s, a lot of Americans, including Americans who supported the war, had turned deeply against it, believing that they had been hornswoggled into this war, that Woodrow Wilson or moneyed interests had basically pushed the country into the war. That's the whole Merchants of Death thesis that became a best-selling book, actually a Book of the Month Club selection in 1934. So people's assessments of what their history is can change very quickly.
Adam Wasserman says, can you unpack, very interesting question, can you unpack why Iraq is worse than Vietnam when the loss of Americans and Vietnamese was much greater, and in Vietnam we were thrown out in the most shameful fashion, while in Iraq we maintain relations with the government?
I think there are actually sort of two reasons for that, but I should preface it by saying I know a number of people who served in senior positions in the Bush administration. Stephen Hadley, who was Deputy National Security Advisor during the first Bush term, and then National Security Advisor during the second Bush term, who have told me that they disagree with this, and they would make the argument made in the question that it was costly, no doubt. Mistakes were made, but at the end of the day, Saddam Hussein is gone, and you're in a situation in which we have an Iraq that is making halting progress. And again, this gets us back to the big question. Reasonable people can disagree about the consequences of events. I think the reason that Iraq shows up, really two reasons. One is I think there is a sense that Vietnam was the first time the United States made the mistake of believing it can go in to another country, but that the decision to do so was motivated by a willingness to engage in ordinary democratic politics. You did have the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Yes, it was sort of slid by, but there was a sense that Americans didn't know better. I really think with the Iraq War, you have a sense, talking to people, that the United States misrepresented the evidence and should have known that this war would be more complicated than it would be otherwise. And I think the second thing is that in the case of Vietnam, and this gets back to the point I made earlier, we tend to think about we know what history is going to be and how it's going to unfold. I think if you would ask this question in 1980, everybody would have said, Yes, Vietnam was absolutely the worst because it shook the foundations of American foreign policy. America's on the decline. We're never going to be able to rally back. But in fact, we did. I mean, the world, just, I would say to anybody, go back and read newspapers from the mid 1970s and get a sense of what people thought about the future of America. It was pretty pessimistic. But again, then you had several decades in which history surprised us. And I think in the case right now, many people look at it and say, we took up a war we shouldn't have. And among other things, besides the immense carnage it caused, it really sort of did not work to our advantage in the Middle East, among other things. It made Iraq much more powerful, Iran more powerful, allowed Iran to spread its influence across the Middle East into the Levant.
Well, now that you've mentioned one of the I words,
Yep.
I'll go ahead and say, where do you think the war on Iran would be ranked? I mean, it's too early to tell, I guess, but at least how we entered this war could be compared to the Iraq war without getting the support of
Yeah.
the coalition and so forth.
Well, since I'm continually telling people to have a bit of humility about making predictions about where the world's going to go, I can't tell you where Iran might end up if we were to do this survey 5 or 10 years from now. Again, I think history could surprise us, could go in ways that people don't think are possible, but also go in ways that many people in my business did predict, would predict, have predicted. What I do think is that when people sort of study the decision making behind this, I suspect that the decision to launch Operation Epic Fury will top the list of examples of how not to make a decision about going to war. I mean, this is not looked to be a case in which the administration really thought through what the consequences would be. I can only go on the basis of what officials say publicly, and the president himself has said publicly that nobody could have predicted that Iran would work to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. Well, but again, not only could it have been predicted, it had been predicted for decades. The issue of what to do about Iran is not a new one. A lot of smart people have been thinking about it since I was a college sophomore. So this has been around. And again, one of the reasons not to do it, it's a big country, difficult terrain, and it has undeniable leverage because it has the ability to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, which it has done.
Jim, how much do you think the dismantling of the State Department and not really having a national security agency as a council anymore has played into this, and that President Trump is making decisions with a very small group of people?
Well, I don't think it helps to have dismantled the State Department, or I think more fairly to say to really have downsized it. I really don't think it helps to have a situation in which you really shrink the National Security Council staff, because those people are really important for doing things like making sure different parts of the government speak to each other, coordinate with each other. They also be very good in terms of promoting what we might call message discipline. Typically, the standard way any major foreign policy initiative by government would be preceded by an effort to decide, what are we going to tell the American people? What are we going to tell our friends, partners, and allies? What are we going to tell our adversaries? That all seems to have been missing here. But at the end of the day, I think even if no cuts had been made to the NSC staff and no cuts had been made to the State Department, we would likely be in the same place. One of the things you learn when you're in government is it doesn't matter how smart staffers are, what good ideas they write, or what brilliant white papers they send up the chain of command. What matters at the end of the day is what the president thinks and who the president listens to. And there's no requirement that a president has to listen to people who hold formal positions in government. And at the end of the day, that's why the burden of being president is so heavy, and why Americans naturally, when big issues happen, they rate the president either succeeding or failing.
Let me bring in this question from Ray Termini. again. With respect to Iran, were the decisions made by several presidents before Trump to take strong or forcible actions regarded as worse decisions? I mean, you could think about pulling out of the JCPOA or
Yep.
certainly 1953 removal of Mossadegh.
Yep. I mean, the one of the surprises for me, if I look at the list in terms of the choices SHAFR historians made, if I were going to point to one thing that President Trump did in his first administration that I would think is a contender for being consequential in belonging on a worse list, it would have been leaving the JCPOA without a clear alternative. That's not necessarily to say that JCPOA was the best agreement ever negotiated. It wasn't. That it solved all the problems we faced. It didn't. That it was going to allow us to put the whole issue behind us. It didn't do that either. But to me, that was the decision in terms of the first Trump administration, I think, that was most consequential when you're talking about contenders for the worst list, more so than the decision to leave the Paris Accords, the climate deal. I think the interesting to me about the decision to support the overthrow of Prime Minister Mossadegh is that I think a lot of historians picked it not because that was in some sense the original sin that led to bad blood between the United States and Iran, though it certainly didn't help. From my conversation with them, I think for many of them, that what they look at it as, it's an instance in which it was really, as I mentioned before, a proof of concept that the United States could go in and engineer the overthrow of other governments, and that those decisions rarely worked in our interest over the long term. You think Guatemala, think in Chile, think in South Vietnam with the coup that led to the death of Diem. So I think that's what that's there for. Now, people who sort of focus on Iran at that time would argue that, and most notably my colleague Ray Takei would argue that the American role in the ouster of Mossadegh is really exaggerated, that his sort of collapse, his ouster, had a lot to do with the fact that he had burned through all his friends and made a lot of enemies.
Want to be sure I bring in somebody you know, Professor Steve Gardner from Baylor. And he says, or asks,
Hope all is good in Waco?
Well, I don't think they're in the Final Four, so they're probably not too happy,
Yeah.
but neither am I in Charlottesville. Did you notice gender differences in the responses? Were women, for example, more likely to support what you would call enlightened national interest than men?
I didn't see any obvious breakdown on that score. Now, again, because I have a PhD in political science and I took all those econometrics courses, I'm always wary of making any big deal out of bivariate correlations. I didn't really see anything that jumped out at me today, and I simply haven't had time to plug all the numbers in and run regressions and see if I can tease anything out.
Want to bring in a comment from the chat box, and it says 50% or more of these items, both best and worst, would be unknown for not recognized by name and not considered chronologically by date if shown to high school students, maybe some college students. This is a good opportunity for you, Jim, to talk about how you're using this, and I'm sure David Rubenstein wanted that, to go beyond knowledgeable audience of CFR and World Affairs Council. How is this beyond the website, including the website, getting out to schools and different groups?
Yeah, well, the website's obviously the most important. And again, people can find it at CFR.org or Google Council on Foreign Relations, Best Worst Foreign Policy
And we have a
decisions.
link here for it, but yeah.
That's very good. I mean, we have worked with a lot of professors who teach U.S. foreign policy. We also distribute it through our academic program that the council has, reaching out to colleges and high schools. I do events like this. I have my own podcast, The President's Inbox, also available at CFR.org and wherever you get your favorite podcast downloads. And every month this year, we're sitting down with an esteemed historian to go through one of these decisions. So we're trying to do everything we can to sort of raise it. And again, one of the reasons to do a list is because, again, people see lists and immediately want to tell you why the list is wrong. So I have a number of people who doubt my list making abilities. I want to say this is not my list. This is the list reflecting the views of members of the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. My ballot was slightly different.
I want to know about
That
your ballot.
I actually sort of diverge from most of my historian brethren, members of SHAFR, in that I would have given a higher ranking to a number of decisions the United States made on the economic front that I think were consequential and should be noted on the worst list. So I would point out, for example, the Embargo Act of 1807, where Thomas Jefferson thought that the way he could push off British and French predations on American shipping was to simply stop trading with the rest of the world. He was the first, but not the last American president to exaggerate what American economic power can do. And one of the reasons why the Embargo Act of 1807, which was followed by the Non-Intercourse Act of 1808, was consequential, as it almost led to New England seceding from the Union, because New England was home, particularly the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to traders who saw their livelihood destroyed by laws passed, in their view, by Virginia planters. Likewise, in my top 10, would be the Tariff Act of 1930, which is better known as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, which people might recall 1,100 economists signed a letter to President Herbert Hoover begging him not to sign the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, arguing that it was going to make the Depression even worse. And while I know as a political scientist, it's always great to make fun of economists, this was one instance in which economists got it exactly right. And the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act really did worsen the Depression, and not just here in the United States, but globally as well, as other countries retaliated against the tariff wall that the Americans put up.
And that's a good segue to this question from Therese Hogan. Do you have a view of what might be considered in the future President Trump's greatest diplomatic blunders? And I wonder if you would put Liberation Day, now almost a year ago, when was it? April 3rd, I think. When
April 2nd, I believe.
April 2nd, announced and put in the tariffs.
Well, again, I have to go back to there's what you think in the moment, and the recognition, if you study enough history, that what people think in the moment may not be what happens. So I want to caution humility. I'm not so sure that I would say Liberation Day was that consequential, in part because a number of the tariffs the president imposed got rolled back voluntarily, most notably those dealing with China, because the Chinese had leverage and the president backed off. Plus, now we have the additional factor that the Supreme Court has ruled that President Trump's use of IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to impose these tariffs was unconstitutional. So that aspect of the president's economic foreign policy making has really been hampered, if not crippled. So I'm not so sure that will be the case. I do think of the things the president has done that in their clearly foreign policy would be Operation Epic Fury. I mean, if you're one thing you're looking at that you see and you say, this could keep, this not only is going not so well to begin with, from a strategic point of view, not a tactical point of view. I have great faith in the ability of the United States military to destroy targets in Iran, but you don't fight wars to break things. You fight wars because you're trying to obtain big political objectives. That was Clausewitz's famous dictum about war being continuation of politics by other means. That is, you do this. And again, Americans should be particularly well aware that the fact that you can bring superior firepower to bear on an adversary doesn't mean that you win the war. Vietnam would be the classic instance. I would argue Iraq, much the same. We may be learning the same lesson again in Iran, but the caveat always is that this might break in ways that no one's anticipating today that would make us reassess our judgment. But I would say right now, the trend line is not positive.
We've talked about how you're reaching out to different audiences, and Gary asks, are the findings used to train American Foreign Service officers? Are they looking at this study? Have you had an opportunity to present it to Foreign Service officers?
I have not done that, but that is a very good idea. I'm not sure, however, right now, from what I know of the revamping of the training of Foreign Service officers, that this is quite what they're interested in. You have to remember the United States government now is operating the principle that we have to remove things that might reflect poorly on American history. This is obviously affecting what's happening at places like the Jefferson Memorial and various Smithsonian museums.
Well, we ought to also mention, if I'm correct, that, and I know that CFR for years has welcomed fellows from the military for a year or two for research and sharing of information and learning, and that has been suspended. Am I correct there?
I don't know what the current status of it is. There was a news report that the Secretary of Defense issued an edict that senior education for senior military officers was going to be halted. But I don't know how that's proceeding.
And also the JFK school at Harvard.
I think there was maybe 15 different institutions.
Well, we have about another minute, and I think a good closing question might be, you look at themes in the best and the worst.
Yep.
Why doesn't the United States really learn and remember some of these lessons? History, many would say, rhymes.
Yep. I agree. History rhymes, it echoes. That's one of the reasons why I pursued this project, because I want to get people to understand that while there is a tendency to think that everything we see today is fresh and new, there are lots of parallels in the past. And the old injunction, Jim, that those who don't learn from history are condemned to repeat it. And I think we can learn a lot from history. Not that it's going to give us a roadmap on what to do or a simple plan that we can follow, but it can allow us to understand perhaps a bit better the nature of our challenges, how they've been answered in the past, and what has worked and what hasn't.
Well, it's a fascinating study. I spent a few days ago just going through all of it in your website. It's tremendous, very interesting. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I know how hard you work on it, and thanks for being the guest on World Now. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me on, Jim, and thank you to all the people with the great questions.
And let me just remind everyone, I'm really excited about our program on April 20th. The title of it is The Iran War, What We Know and What Comes Next. And I have purposely waited to do this and have just three tremendous guests. One, Stephen Cook from the Council on Foreign Relations. He's a senior fellow and focuses on the Middle East. And then Beth Sanner, who many of you, I'm sure, if you're watching CNN, you've seen her, former Deputy Director of Intelligence and on CNN as a global contributor. And then Ambassador Deborah Jones, who is our ambassador to Libya and to Kuwait. A little change, though. This program that will on April 20th will be 1 hour later, because we're also going to simulcast with the Forum public radio station in Santa Fe. So again, thanks for being with us, and do read the report. You'll enjoy it. Have a great evening.